It is just after 9 in the morning on the 12th of April 1961, and on a flat plain in the middle of the Kazakh steppe, a young man is lying on his back inside a metal sphere, barely wider than he is tall. He is 27 years old. His name is Yuri Gagarin, and in a few minutes, he will become the first human being to leave the planet. Below him, 300 tons of kerosene and liquid oxygen wait inside a rocket that has never carried a person before. Around him, for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, there is almost nothing. No city, no forest, no coastline, only grass and wind, and the long, flat horizon of Central Asia. At 9:07, the engines light. The rocket climbs off the pad on a column of fire. And a voice from the steppe, calm, almost cheerful, says a single word that will be repeated for the rest of the century. Polygon, let's go. 108 minutes later, Gagarin has circled the entire Earth once and come home. The space age has begun, and it has begun not over Florida, not above Moscow, but here, on a patch of dry grassland that most of the world could not find on a map. The place is called Baikonur, and the strange thing, the thing almost no one outside this region ever stops to consider, is a simple question with a very long answer. Why was the door to the stars built in the emptiest place on Earth? To understand that, you have to look at the country the launch pad sits inside. A nation 9 times larger than any single country in Europe, and in places emptier than almost anywhere on that continent. A land that has been, within the span of one human lifetime, a graveyard, a proving ground for the most dangerous weapons ever made, and the launch pad for all of humanity. This is Kazakhstan. It is the 9th largest country in the world, and by far the largest that most people have never truly pictured. You could lay Western Europe down inside its borders and still have room to spare. And yet fewer than 20 million people live here, most of them gathered in a handful of cities at the edges, leaving the vast center of the country almost exactly as it has been for thousands of years. An ocean of grass, the steppe. That word, steppe, does not really prepare you for the scale of it. This is the largest dry steppe on the planet, a belt of grassland and semi-desert that runs for thousands of kilometers without a hill to interrupt it. Stand in the middle of it and turn in a full circle, and every direction looks the same. Grass to the horizon, sky to the horizon, wind that has crossed 1,000 kilometers of nothing before it reaches you. It is exactly this emptiness that brought the rockets here. In the early 1950s, when the Soviet Union went looking for a place to test the first intercontinental missiles and then later to launch the first satellites, its engineers needed somewhere enormous and flat and almost unpopulated. Somewhere a rocket could rise and a spent stage could fall without landing on anyone. Somewhere near the equator facing south with clear skies most of the year. The Kazakh steppe answered every requirement at once. And so, in 1955, thousands of soldiers and engineers arrived by rail at a small station called Turatam and began building a secret city in the grass. The ground was so hard it had to be blasted apart. The winds were so fierce they tore at the scaffolding. Rumors were spread to hide what was happening. Some locals were told a stadium was being built. The site was given a name that was deliberately a lie. Baikonur is the name of a small mining town more than 300 kilometers away. The Soviets borrowed it and stamped it on the launch complex to send Western intelligence in the wrong direction. For years, the real Baikonur sat on the map exactly where the spaceport was not. Remember that name and the deception behind it. It will matter again, much later, in a way no one in 1955 could have predicted. What they built out there in the grass became the busiest spaceport in the history of the world. From these pads rose the first intercontinental missile, the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, a metal sphere the size of a beach ball, whose radio beep terrified an entire hemisphere. The first spacecraft to reach the vicinity of the moon, the first man, the first woman, the first space station. Even a Soviet space shuttle called Buran, which flew once without a crew, guided entirely by computer, and was then abandoned to rust inside its hangar. Not every first was a triumph. A month after Sputnik, a second satellite went up, carrying the first living creature ever to orbit the Earth, a small stray dog named Laika, taken off the streets of Moscow and trained, in a matter of weeks, for a journey there was never any plan to bring her home from. For decades, the official story held that she had died gently, days into the flight. Only in 2002 did one of the scientists involved finally admit the truth. Laika had died of overheating within a few hours of launch, frightened and alone, a few hundred kilometers above the same steppe where she had been trained. Her capsule sits in the museum at Baikonur now. She is, in her way, the first of this land's many small, withheld tragedies, a truth kept quiet for 40 years and then let out, too late to matter to the one it was kept from. Behind almost all of it stood a single man whose name, while he lived, was one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Soviet Union. The newspapers of the day called him only the chief designer. No photograph, no name. When Gagarin flew, when Sputnik beeped, the world was told that Soviet science had done it, but the specific human being who designed the rockets was kept in the dark, hidden even from the cosmonauts' families, because the state feared that if the West knew who he was, they would try to kill him. His name was Sergei Korolev, and to understand how remarkable it is that he was the one who carried humanity into orbit, you have to know where he had been 20 years earlier. But that part of the story belongs to a darker chapter of this country, and we are not there yet. Hold his name too. The steppe keeps its secrets in layers. Because before it was a launch pad, and long before it was a testing ground, this land was something older and quieter. It was home. Out on that endless grassland lives an animal that looks as though it wandered in from another age, because in a sense it did. The saiga antelope has survived since the last ice age, when it grazed alongside mammoths and woolly rhinos. It is a strange, almost comic-looking creature, pale and slender, with an oversized, downturned nose like a small trunk. That nose is not decoration. It is an air conditioning system. In summer, it filters the dust kicked up by the herd. In the brutal cold of the steppe winter, it warms the freezing air before it reaches the animal's lungs. The saiga is built in every detail to endure a place that tries to kill everything on it. And it has come very close to not enduring at all. In the spring of 2015, in the space of just a few weeks, a bacterial infection swept through the calving herds and killed more than 200,000 saiga. Whole populations simply lay down in the grass and died. Scientists who arrived to count the living instead counted the dead across an area the size of a small country. It looked for a while like the end. It was not the end. What happened next is one of the great animal recovery stories on Earth, and it runs straight through the heart of this documentary. So remember the saiga lying dead in the grass. We will come back to that plain and to what is grazing on it now. For thousands of years, the people who lived on this steppe lived the way the saiga does, by moving. They were nomads, following the grass and the seasons with their horses and their herds, carrying their homes with them. The round felt tent they lived in, the yurt, could be packed onto a camel in an hour and raised again by nightfall 100 kilometers away. It was, in its way, a brilliant answer to an impossible landscape. You cannot farm most of the steppe. The soil is thin, the rain is scarce, the winters are savage. But you can move across it. You can let your animals turn grass no human could eat into milk and meat and wool. The Kazakhs domesticated the horse's usefulness to an art. They drank fermented mare's milk, called kimiz. They made music on a two-stringed instrument called the dombra, and a bowed instrument called the kobiz, whose sound is said to imitate the wind and the cry of the swan. Their epics were not written down but sung for hours from memory by traveling bards who carried a people's entire history in their voices. And they built a code of hospitality so strict it worked as a law of the steppe. A traveler who arrived at a yurt, even a stranger, even an enemy, was to be fed and sheltered without question. On a grassland this vast and this empty, turning someone away could mean their death, and everyone understood that one day the stranger at the door might be them. A guest was given the best the household had. At a feast that meant beshbarmak, boiled meat, and broad noodles eaten with the hands, whose name means simply 5 fingers, the choicest piece placed in front of the honored guest by the host's own hand. Hospitality here was never merely good manners. It was survival, shared out against a landscape that offered none of its own. And they hunted with eagles. This is one of the oldest partnerships between humans and a wild predator anywhere in the world. On the steppe and in the Altai Mountains to the east, a hunter, a berkutchi, takes a young golden eagle from the cliffs and over years of patient work builds a bond with a bird that could take his eye out with a single strike. The eagle rides on his arm, hooded, until he lifts the hood and sends her out across the snow after a fox or a hare. A trained golden eagle can spot prey from 2 kilometers away and drop on it at over 200 kilometers an hour. For the hunter, the eagle is not a tool. It is a partner and a member of the family. When she has hunted for him for many years, tradition says, he releases her back to the mountains to live wild and raise her own young, a debt repaid. The bond is passed from father to child, and now increasingly from father to daughter, across 4,000 years. That chain very nearly broke. When the Soviet state forced the nomads off the steppe and into collective farms in the 1930s, the whole architecture of this life, the moving, the herds, the eagles, the songs, was outlawed or destroyed almost overnight. Many of the families who kept the eagle hunting tradition alive did so only by fleeing across the border into Mongolia, where a Kazakh community carried it unbroken through the decades. What survives today survives because those people refused to let it die. There are perhaps 250 practicing eagle hunters left. Every one of them is a thread back to a world that the 20th century tried very hard to erase. The nomads were not the first to cross this steppe either. They were only the latest. Long before them, this grassland was the northern highway of the ancient world, the corridor the Silk Road took as it carried silk and spices and ideas between China and the Mediterranean. Caravan cities rose along it. In the south of the country stands the city of Turkestan, and at its heart, the mausoleum of Khoja Ahmed Yasawi, a vast, unfinished monument of turquoise-tiled brick begun on the orders of the conqueror Timur in the 14th century. Its builders left it incomplete when Timur died, and it has stood, half-finished and wholly magnificent, for more than 600 years, a pilgrimage site for the faithful of Central Asia. But the deepest layer of all was found by accident in 1969, in a burial mound not far from the old capital. Archaeologists open a 2,500-year-old grave in a low earthen hill called a kurgan. Inside, they find the remains of a young warrior of the Saka people, the Central Asian branch of the Scythians, the horse-riding nomads who ruled these steppes when Athens was in its golden age. And the warrior is dressed head to foot in gold. More than 4,000 individual pieces of it. A tall, pointed headdress covered in golden animals, winged horses and snow leopards and birds. A gold-plated tunic, boots sewn with gold. The archaeologists call the figure the Golden Man, and today a copy stands at the very center of the nation's identity, on top of a monument in the capital, 1 foot on a winged snow leopard. What the Golden Man tells you is that this apparently empty grassland has been a center of the world before. 25 centuries ago, the people who rode these plains had gold and craft and an entire cosmology, and then they were gone, leaving almost nothing above the surface. The steppe does that. It swallows what stands on it and keeps it underground. Which is a lesson worth remembering, because the 20th century was about to bury a great deal here. Turn west and north from the mountains, though, and before the darkness, there is still beauty to find, tucked into the folds of a country most people assume is featureless. In the southeast, where the steppe rises to meet the Tian Shan, the mountains of heaven, the old capital sits under a wall of snow peaks. Almaty. The name comes from the word for apple, and this is not sentiment, it is science. The wild forests in the mountains above Almaty are the ancestral home of the domestic apple. Every apple in every orchard on Earth, in Washington and Normandy and New Zealand, descends from a wild species, Malus sieversii, that still grows on these slopes. The fruit you ate this week began here, on the edge of Kazakhstan, tens of thousands of years ago. Higher up, the water runs clear and improbably blue. Kolsai and Kandy, lakes cradled in the pines, one of them holding the bleached trunks of a drowned spruce forest that still stands upright beneath the surface, a ghost wood under cold water. Big Almaty Lake glows a turquoise so intense it looks unreal. And a short drive east, the earth splits open into the Charon Canyon, a corridor of red and ochre rock carved by a river over millions of years, so like its famous cousin in Arizona that people call it the Grand Canyon's little brother, though almost no one outside the region has heard its name. And moving through these mountains, seen by almost no one, is a ghost. The snow leopard is the emblem of Almaty, printed on the city's crest, and it is one of the hardest large animals on the planet to find. It lives high on the rock above the tree line, wrapped in a coat of smoke-gray fur, patterned to vanish against stone and snow. Its tail is nearly as long as its body, thick and heavy, wrapped around itself for warmth and used for balance as it leaps across gaps that would kill it if it missed. It can bring down prey 3 times its weight and then drag it up a cliff, and it is almost never seen. Researchers who have spent their whole careers in these mountains have laid eyes on a wild snow leopard only a handful of times. It watches, and it is not watched. For a country that has spent a century being defined by outsiders who never really looked at it, the snow leopard is a fitting national ghost. Present, powerful, overlooked. Far to the west lies a different kind of strangeness. The plateaus of Mangustau, near the Caspian Sea, dissolve into a landscape that looks borrowed from another planet. White chalk cliffs and lone rock towers rising out of the desert at Bozira, sculpted by a sea that dried up millions of years ago. To the east, in the Altin Emel Reserve, there is a single enormous dune of pale sand that, when the wind is right and the sand is dry, hums. A low, deep, organ-like note that the nomads believed was the voice of a spirit. Geologists now know it is the friction of millions of grains sliding against one another. But standing at the foot of a singing mountain of sand, the science does very little to reduce the strangeness of it. And in the middle of the country, defying every rule about what a lake should be, lies Balkhash, one of the largest lakes in Asia and a geographical riddle. A narrow strait divides it in two, and the water on the western side is fresh enough to drink, while the water on the eastern side is salt. One lake, 2 chemistries. The country is full of contradictions like this, held quietly in place, waiting for someone to notice. For most of its history, this was a land at the far edge of other people's empires. It was ruled from Mongolia, from Persia, from the Russian court. And then, in the 20th century, it was ruled from Moscow, and everything changed in ways that were sometimes triumphant and often catastrophic. The catastrophe came first. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Soviet state decided to end the nomadic way of life for good. Collectivization. The herds that had crossed this steppe for thousands of years were seized and gathered into state farms. Families who had always moved were ordered to stop, to settle, to hand over their animals to men who did not know how to keep them alive through a steppe winter. The animals died in enormous numbers, and then the people did. The famine that followed, which the Kazakhs called the Ashashilik, killed around 1.5 million people. In a population that small, it was a wound that reached into every family. Something close to 1/3 of the entire Kazakh nation died of hunger in the space of a few years, on some of the most fertile grazing land in Asia, because the system that had kept them alive for millennia had been dismantled by decree. Many of those who survived did so by fleeing across the borders into China and Mongolia and beyond. For the first time in its history, the Kazakhs became a minority in their own land. The state that did this did not stop there. It planted a different kind of institution on the steppe and made the emptiness serve it. Across central Kazakhstan spread one of the largest networks of forced labor camps in the Soviet system. Karlag, the Karaganda camp, held hundreds of thousands of prisoners across an area the size of a European country. And nearby was a place with a name that translates coldly to the acronym Aral Sea. It was a camp built specifically for the wives of men the state had declared enemies. Women were sent there, thousands of kilometers from home, for the crime of having been married to someone the regime had shot or imprisoned. Their children were taken from them. Some of those children were raised in state orphanages that erased their names. And it was here, into this exact system, that a young rocket engineer named Sergei Korolev disappeared in the 1930s. The man who would one day put the first human into orbit was arrested during Stalin's purges, tortured, and sentenced to the labor camps. He was sent for a time to the goldfields of the Russian Far East, where prisoners died by the thousand. He lost most of his teeth to scurvy. His jaw was broken and never set properly, an injury that would trouble him for the rest of his life. By any reasonable measure, he should have died there, one anonymous body among millions, and the space age should have belonged to someone else, or to no one, or to a later century. Instead, the same state that had nearly killed him needed him. As war approached, the Soviet Union pulled its imprisoned engineers out of the camps and put them to work designing weapons, still prisoners, but now useful ones. Korolev survived. He was released. And within 20 years, the man the Gulag had broken was standing on the Kazakh steppe at Baikonur, watching his rocket carry Yuri Gagarin into the sky, having built the machine that made the Soviet state, in the eyes of the world, immortal. He never spoke publicly about the camps. His name was a state secret until the day he died, in 1966, on an operating table, from complications that some believe traced back to the injuries the Gulag had given him 30 years before. The world learned who the chief designer was only after his death, when the Soviet Union finally put his name on the front page and buried his ashes in the Kremlin wall. One man's life holding both halves of this country inside it, the terror and the triumph, the grave and the launch pad. The steppe keeps its secrets in layers, and Korolev is the seam where two of them meet. The steppe itself keeps living through all of it. High in the Tian Shan, the snow leopard patrols its rock, and out on the plains, in the long grass, the pale herds move and endure the way they have since the ice. But the darkest chapter this land carried in the 20th century was not the famine or the camps. It was something the world would come to fear more than any of them. And it happened, like the rockets, because this place looked, from Moscow, like nothing at all. In the summer of 1949, Soviet engineers marked out a stretch of eastern Kazakh steppe, roughly the size of a small country, and declared it uninhabited. It was not uninhabited. Around this area and downwind of it lived hundreds of thousands of people in villages and towns that had been there for generations. But their presence was, as far as the plan was concerned, a technicality. At 7 in the morning on the 29th of August 1949, on top of a steel tower on that steppe, the Soviet Union detonates its first atomic bomb. The device is codenamed First Lightning. In the West, it will be nicknamed Joe 1, after Stalin. A mushroom cloud rises over the grassland. The arms race, until that morning something the Americans believed they controlled, becomes a contest between two powers that can both end the world. That first blast was the beginning, not the end. Over the next 40 years, the Soviet Union detonated 456 nuclear devices at this one site, which came to be known simply as the polygon. More than 100 of them were exploded in the open air above the ground, throwing fallout downwind across the villages. The combined force of everything detonated there is estimated at around 2,500 times the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The people living around the polygon were not evacuated. They were not warned. In many cases, they were not even told what was happening. When the ground shook and the sky lit up and the windows blew in, they were expected to say nothing. One man who lived nearby remembered being thrown into the air as a child by a blast he only understood decades later to have been a nuclear test. The authorities studied the people quietly. A medical facility was set up in the region, disguised as a clinic for tuberculosis, that monitored the health of the exposed population for Moscow, recording what radiation did to them over the years, while telling them almost nothing about what it found. The consequences moved through the generations like a current. Cancers, birth defects, immune disorders. The government of independent Kazakhstan now officially recognizes more than 1.25 million of its citizens as victims of the tests. Around the polygon, in the poorest villages, people still live on contaminated land because they cannot afford to leave, drinking from the same water, farming the same soil, and in some cases, cutting up the abandoned test structures for scrap metal to sell. And yet the story of the polygon is not only a story of what was done to these people, it is also the story of what they did about it. In February of 1989, at a televised poetry reading in Almaty, a poet named Oljas Suleymanov stood up and, instead of reading his poems, read out a demand for the nuclear testing to stop. It was an extraordinary act of nerve in a state that did not tolerate defiance. And it lit a fire. Within days, a movement had formed, the Nevada Semipalatinsk movement, named to link the Kazakh test site with its American counterpart in the Nevada desert. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, miners and teachers and scientists and artists, joined it. It was one of the very first mass civic movements the Soviet Union had ever seen from within. And it worked. The pressure it created helped force an end to testing at the polygon. The last device was detonated in 1989. 2 years later, as the Soviet Union collapsed, the site was closed for good. The town that gave the polygon its name, Semipalatinsk, has since been renamed Semey, as if to set down some part of the weight it had carried. On its edge stands a memorial to the victims, a tall stone slab split as though by a blast, sheltering the figure of a mother shielding her child. It is called Stronger Than Death. The people here chose deliberately to remember and to make the remembering visible in stone, so that what was done to them in secret for 40 years could never again be done quietly. Among the faces of that movement is an artist named Karibek Kuyukov. He was born near the polygon, downwind, and he was born without arms, one of the many children whose bodies carried the radiation their parents had absorbed. He became a painter anyway. He holds the brush in his mouth or between his toes, and he paints the steppe and the mushroom clouds and the faces of the affected, and he travels the world as an ambassador for the abolition of nuclear weapons. His life is an argument made in paint that this land refuses to be only a victim. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991 and Kazakhstan became for the first time in its history an independent country, it woke up to discover it had inherited something almost no one had told its people about. On its soil sat the fourth largest nuclear arsenal in the world. More than 1,000 warheads, enough to end civilization several times over, sitting in silos in the grass. Hold that fact too, because what this brand new, impoverished country decided to do with the most powerful weapons on Earth is the quiet hinge on which its entire modern identity turns, and we will return to it before the end. The Soviet century left one more open wound on this land, and this one you can see from space. In the 1960s, Soviet planners diverted the two great rivers of Central Asia, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, away from the sea they fed and out onto the desert to grow cotton. The sea they were feeding was the Aral, and at the time, it was the fourth largest lake in the world. Then the rivers stopped arriving, and the Aral began, slowly and then catastrophically, to die. Over the following decades, it lost around 90% of its water. The shoreline retreated by tens of kilometers. The port town of Aralsk, which had once sent tinned fish across the Soviet Union, found itself stranded in a desert. Its harbor, a dry basin. Its fishing fleet resting on cracked mud where the sea used to be. Photographs from those years show rusting ships lying on their sides in the sand, kilometers from any water, as if a giant had picked up the ocean and carried it away. 50 years ago, that place was underwater. Now, camels walk between the wrecks. But here is what almost no account of the Aral Sea tells you. Part of it is coming back. Kazakhstan sat at the northern end of the lake, and when it became clear that saving the whole sea was impossible, the country chose to save what it could. In 2005, with support from the World Bank, it built a 13-kilometer dam, the Korolev Dam, across the narrow neck that separated the northern basin from the dying south. The idea was simple: stop the water of the Sir Darya from draining away into the vast, unrecoverable south, and let it pool, instead, in the north. It worked faster than anyone expected. Within months, the water in the North Aral began to rise. The level came up by meters. The salinity, which had grown so extreme that almost nothing could live in it, began to fall. And then the fish came back. Species that had vanished returned to waters that had been effectively dead. Fishing boats that had been beached for a generation went back out. The sea returned to within a few kilometers of Aralsk, whose people can once again, some days, smell the water. Kazakhstan is now working to raise the dam higher and pull the shoreline closer still. The southern sea in the neighboring country is mostly gone, a salt desert where a lake used to be, and it is not coming back. The recovery in the north is partial and hard-won and real. It is one of the few places on Earth where a great environmental catastrophe has been, even a little, reversed. And it happened here, on the same steppe that carried the bomb and the rocket, because a poor country decided that a dying sea was worth 13 kilometers of concrete and a decade of patience. There is another dying sea in this country, and another creature clinging to it. The Caspian on the western shore is the largest inland body of water on the planet, and it is home to a seal found nowhere else. The Caspian seal is one of the smallest true seals in the world, a compact grey animal that hauls out on the winter ice to give birth to pups with coats of pure white fur. It has been swimming in this sea since it was cut off from the ocean millions of years ago. Its numbers have fallen hard, from millions a century ago to a fraction of that today, as the sea shrinks and industry crowds its shores. And so it joins a long list of things on this land that are holding on. The saiga, the snow leopard, the eagle hunters, the North Aral, the seal on the shrinking sea, a country that is, in its bones, a study in endurance. Which brings us back to the launch pad in the grass and to the question we opened with. Why here? Why was the door to the stars built in the emptiest place on Earth? By now the answer is clear, and it is the same answer that explains the polygon and the camps and the diverted rivers. The emptiness. This land was chosen again and again precisely because from the outside it looked like nothing, like a place where enormous and dangerous things could be done without anyone important having to see them. The bomb and the rocket were built on the same logic, on the same step, for the same reason. The genius and the horror of the 20th century share an address in Kazakhstan. But the rocket had a second act that the bomb never did, and it is the reason the title of this film is not an exaggeration. Baikonur outlived the Soviet Union that built it. When the country split apart in 1991, the world's first spaceport suddenly found itself on foreign soil. It belonged now to independent Kazakhstan, and Russia, which had inherited the space program, needed it because there was nowhere else to launch. So the two countries made a deal. Russia leases Baikonur from Kazakhstan to this day for around $115 million a year on an agreement that now runs to the year 2050. And here, the old lie comes back around. The city of Baikonur, the launch complex and the town beside it, is not governed like the rest of Kazakhstan. It is a leased enclave, run under Russian law, on Russian time, with its own administration, a piece of one country embedded inside another. A place that was named to deceive half a century ago is today one of the strangest jurisdictions on the map, a corner of Russia sitting in the middle of the Kazakh steppe. The deception outlived the deceivers. For decades, this arrangement was a curiosity, and then for 10 years, it became something much larger. It became the only way off the planet. In 2011, the United States retired its space shuttle. For the first time since the 1960s, the most powerful spacefaring nation on Earth had no way of its own to send a human being into orbit. And so, quietly, an extraordinary thing became true. Every single astronaut going to the International Space Station, American, European, Japanese, Canadian, Russian, every human being who left the planet did so from one place. They flew to Kazakhstan. They trained in the cold on the Kazakh steppe. They walked out to a Soviet-era rocket at Baikonur, the same complex, in some cases, the very same pad that had launched Gagarin, and they rode a design more than 50 years old up into the dark. For 10 years, the entire human presence in space depended on this grassland. The most advanced human beings, the astronauts of the 21st century, could reach the future only by passing through the oldest spaceport in the world, in a country most of them, before they trained there, could barely have placed on a map. Think about what that means. Every photograph of Earth taken from the space station in that decade, every experiment, every spacewalk, every message beamed home from orbit began on the same plane where Korolev's rocket rose, where the saiga graze, where 25 centuries ago a Scythian warrior was buried in gold. When we say Kazakhstan launches the world to space, it is not a slogan. For 10 years, it was a simple, literal, physical fact. The world went to space through Kazakhstan and through nowhere else. The night before a launch, an astronaut spends their last hours on Earth in a small cottage at Baikonur. There are two of these cottages, kept as they were, one where Korolev stayed and one where Gagarin slept before his flight in 1961. By tradition, every crew signs the door of Gagarin's cottage before they leave for the pad. More than 60 years of signatures from every spacefaring nation layered on a single wooden door in the middle of the steppe. It is perhaps the most quietly astonishing guestbook on the planet. And out beyond the pad, past the fence of the enclave, the grass runs on to the horizon, exactly as it did before any of this began. The rockets rise from it. The fallout settled on it. The famine emptied it. The gold lies buried in it. And it simply carries all of it, the way it has carried everything, without comment, under a very large sky. So what does a country do when it has inherited all of this at once? Return for a moment to the fourth largest nuclear arsenal in the world, sitting in the grass in 1991. A newly independent country, poor, uncertain, surrounded by larger powers, holding more than 1,000 warheads. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to keep them, to hold on to that terrible leverage as insurance. Kazakhstan gave them up. All of them. It closed the polygon on the 29th of August, 1991, exactly 42 years to the day after the first bomb was detonated there, as though to close the circle deliberately. And over the following years, working with Russia and the United States, it handed over every warhead, sealed the test tunnels, and removed the material that could have made more. The country that had absorbed a quarter of all the nuclear tests ever conducted chose, when it finally had the power in its own hands, to lay it down. That decision became the founding act of the nation. Not a battle, not a conquest, a renunciation. Kazakhstan built its modern identity around having said no to the very thing its soil had been used to build. And it has spent the decades since as one of the world's steadiest voices for nuclear disarmament. Its argument carried, in part, by a man who paints with his mouth. The new country then did something almost no one else has attempted in the modern age. It built itself a capital out of nothing. In 1997, Kazakhstan moved its seat of government away from Almaty in the green and mountainous southeast to a small, wind-scoured town in the flat center of the northern steppe, a place where the winter cold is among the most extreme of any capital on Earth. And on that bare grassland, in a matter of years, it raised a new city of glass and steel and light, all at once, from the ground up. Towers by famous architects, a great transparent tent, a monument shaped like a tree of life, with the winged snow leopard of the Golden Man set beneath it, planted at what is nearly the exact center of the country. Where there had been only grass and frozen wind, there is now a capital of well over 1 million people. It is, depending on how you choose to see it, either an act of extraordinary national will or an act of sheer defiance against a landscape that has spent thousands of years insisting nothing permanent can stand on it. The steppe swallowed the Scythians and their gold. It swallowed the caravan cities and the camps. And here is a country, barely 30 years old, printing its own money, the tenge, for the first time in its history, and answering the grassland by building a skyline in the middle of it and daring the wind to take it back. Perhaps on this land, will and defiance were always the same thing. And having decided what it would not be, the country turned slowly to repairing what had been broken. The North Aral is rising behind its dam, and out on the central steppe, on the same grassland where the saiga died in their hundreds of thousands in 2015, something remarkable has happened. The herds came back. Protected by one of the largest conservation efforts on the planet, spread across an area of steppe and desert larger than many countries, the saiga recovered with a speed that stunned the scientists watching. From a low point of a few tens of thousands, the population has climbed past 2.5 million animals. The species that looked a decade ago like it might vanish now moves across the plains in numbers not seen in living memory. In 2024, that conservation effort was awarded one of the world's major environmental prizes. The saiga, lying dead in the grass at the start of this film, are today the greatest large mammal recovery on Earth. And the steppe is being given back something even older than the saiga. In the summer of 2024, a military transport plane landed at a small, reopened airport in central Kazakhstan, carrying a cargo that had not set foot in this country for around 200 years. Przewalski's horses, the last truly wild horse on Earth, the only kind that was never tamed, never ridden, never bred by human hands. It once ran across these steppes in great numbers, and then hunting and habitat loss wiped it out, until by the 1960s it was extinct in the wild, gone from every open plain on the planet. Every Przewalski's horse alive today descends from just 13 animals that were caught before it disappeared, and kept and slowly bred back from the edge in the zoos of Europe. Now they are coming home. The first horses spent a year adjusting on the steppe, and then, in the summer of 2025, the gates were opened and they walked out onto the open grassland, wild again, in the land their ancestors ran 2 centuries ago. More are following, enough to build a herd that can sustain itself. The horse that only exists at all because 13 were caught is galloping once more across the Kazakh steppe. This is the country in the end, not the punchline the outside world reduced it to, not empty, never empty. A land that carried humanity to the stars and absorbed the century's worst violence for exactly the same reason, because it looked, from far away, like nothing. And then, when the century was over and it finally stood on its own, it chose. It gave up the bomb. It saved half of a sea it had been told was gone. It brought back a herd from the dead and a wild horse from extinction. We tell the story of the space race as an American story or a Russian one of Cape Canaveral and mission control in Houston. But the first human being to leave this planet did it from a plane most of us cannot find on a map, in a country we turned into a joke, and for 10 years of this new century, every soul who reached orbit reached it through that same grass. The history of us leaving Earth is, in a way no one talks about, a Kazakh history. The rockets still rise from Baikonur. The eagle still rides on the hunter's arm. The saiga still move in their millions, and the wild horse runs again. And out beyond the launch pad, the steppe goes on to the horizon, keeping everything, forgetting nothing, under a sky wide enough to hold a whole century of what human beings are, at their most dangerous and their most magnificent, and often on the very same ground, both at once. This was Kazakhstan. Thank you for watching. Until the next journey.